Well, hi everyone out there. This is Dr. Jeffrey Hanna at Atlas Health, and I'm doing a new kind of video here. It's a new kind of year, 2022, and I figured we'd try to put together some of the best bits that I can possibly have to offer. I still don't know what I'm going to call these kinds of videos, but I'm leaning towards something called Far Side Simplicity. So what's the idea? Well, if any of you know me, I have a ridiculous knack for being able to take this amount of information, drawing it out this much, but then being able to break it down into its key pieces. Because in reality, when it comes to matters of health, some of these topics, they're quite very complicated. But if we can take the time to translate them, to break them down, despite their complexities, into their essence, we have a much better understanding of knowing what they actually mean. Because when we know what they mean, well, then it gives us an opportunity to do something with it. And so, who are these kinds of videos going to be for? These videos are going to be for people who are looking for answers for challenging health conditions. But then they're also going to be for those doctors and healthcare practitioners so that we can have a better understanding and appreciation for why these different kinds of conditions do matter, ultimately so we can help people get better long-term kind of outcomes. At least that's what my hope. We'll see as we go here. So these videos are going to be a little bit more technical than some of the other ones that I oftentimes do, but I am going to try to break them down, as I said, so that we get the big idea at the end of this. And so what did I do? I went on to PubMed, and PubMed, if you're not familiar with that, basically it's a research database. Any kind of publication that's worth its salt is ultimately published on PubMed, and I'm always on the lookout for articles that are going to be related to neck health, communication between the brain, the body, and different kinds of issues that people can experience if and when that area is not communicated and working the way that it should be. And so to start out 2022, I came across this little beauty right here. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be referencing it all right here. Don't worry, I'm not going to be reading the whole thing aloud for you. Brand new though. A new hypothesis for the pathophysiology of symptomatic adult Chiari Malformation type 1. So, if you've been diagnosed, your family member diagnosed with a Chiari Malformation, that's probably how you've come across this video. So, first and foremost, what are we talking about? We're talking about a condition of the brain. The brain, well, normally should be sitting inside of the skull. And if this is a little giant model of the base of the skull, we would basically be expecting the brain to sit in this space right through here. And then this space right here, that's the opening at the base of the skull. It's called the foramen magnum. And the brain should not go into that. Because what we're talking about then is you're talking about the spinal canal. Brain's not supposed to go in there. But this is what the issue of what a Chiari malformation is. I want you to think, and I use this analogy very, very commonly, I want you to think of a balloon with a piece of string attached to it, okay? So the brain is the balloon. Your spinal cord is the string. So the balloon's sitting here, and the string should be freely floating like this. Well, I want you to imagine that what I did was I took the string and started yanking on the balloon like that. What's going to happen with the base of the balloon? Well, the base of the balloon, it's going to start sticking down into the opening, into the space where it doesn't belong. And guess what? There's only so much room in there. Why? Because it's solid bone. If you start trying to shove the brain into a spot where it don't fit, well, guess what? That's going to cause pressure. It's going to cause a lot of different irritations with the brainstem, with the balance centers, with the vital life control mechanisms, and also all of the information going up and down to the brain. So what do people who have Chiari malformations commonly experience? Headaches, migraines, balance disorders, and a combination of most peculiar kinds of other neurological symptoms. And so as we go through this article, I just need you to have that understanding first. If you're not terribly familiar, okay, this is what a Chiari malformation is. So let's go first and have a little look at just a little bit of an overview about what these guys are going to talk about in this particular article. So it's a herniation, bulging of the brain down through that opener. Its cause is not well known, but there are a few ideas that we have. So symptoms are believed to be due to the herniation producing resistance of the what's called cerebrospinal fluid. It's the fluid that circulates in and of the brain, and it's what supplies and provides all of its oxygen, its energy, and its nutrients. So if you've got a disruption of that normal flow, I want you to sort of imagine that you grab your wrist like this, hold it really, really tight, and do that for, about 5 minutes. Don't literally do this, of course, but you'll feel the pressure because fluid's not circulating to your hand or from your hand the way it's supposed to be. Same thing when you're talking about the brain here. It's not known why some people become symptomatic, but recently it has been proposed that, and this is the acronym they're going to use here, CMI, Chiari Malformation Type 1, symptoms are predominantly due to instability of either the atlantoaxial or the atlanto-occipital joints as the cerebellar tonsils herniate to prevent mechanical pinching. What does this mean? It means that you've got the base of the skull, then you've got a C1 vertebra called an atlas. And below that, you're going to have a C2 vertebra. These are the ones that are going to be responsible for this movement and this movement, principally right there. And what the researchers are proposing here is that if you have an injury that's damaged the ligaments and causing this thing to move aberrantly, so this is not moving the way that it should be, that is actually setting the stage and is at least one of the contributing factors in terms of what's actually producing the symptoms of the Chiari malformation in the first place. What's interesting to note, only a small percentage of patients exhibit clinical instability, and these theories do not account for asymptomatic herniations. In other words, a lot of people, probably far more people than we know about, actually have this descent of their brain into the cervical canal, but we don't know about it because they're not experiencing symptoms. In addition, there's a lot of other people who seem to, exhibit symptoms, but based on the traditional definitions, instability, the idea that, okay, hey, these ligaments have been really torn, really damaged, and as a result, your head's not going to quite, but similarly fall off your shoulders. There's a lot of people, they're not in that category, and yet they're still experiencing all the same problems. So what these guys are proposing here is this. They're saying that if you have, in a nutshell, damage to the joints between the base of the skull, so C0, and the atlas vertebra, C1, or between the atlas vertebra and C2, otherwise known as the axis, so C0, C1, or C1, C2, that it's going to then at least have the potential to impart some kind of mechanical tension that irritates the spinal cord, similar to how we were talking about pulling on that string. And the consequence of that is it's going to lead to, quote, chronic instability because the joints are not moving right. Let me slide this down a little bit. Often subclinical, which means that you can have all kinds of different tests, but nobody can reproduce the true pathology, even if you've had all different kinds of CTs, MRIs, and all this sort of stuff. This, in turn, causes overwork of the suboccipital muscles, little guys in the back of the skull that support and facilitate how this area is going to move as they try to compensate for the instability. And then over time, repeated activation of these muscles leads to mechanical overload of what are called myodural bridges. Myodural bridges are ligaments that anchor onto the inside of the C1, onto the inside of the C2, onto the inside of the C3, the vertebrae in the top part of your neck, into the surrounding muscles, into the surrounding ligaments, and they do that so that normally your spinal cord isn't crushed when you do this. Because think about it, if you're nodding your head up and down, pull the model out like this, if you're nodding the head up and down, this is the normal movement that should be happening, something like that, that's going to be causing that space right there to, guess what, it'll get smaller. And you don't want the cord to be compressed or crushed. So what myodural bridges, these ligaments, do is they normally keep the area open. In other words, they prevent that area from getting squished. But if you have this overwork of the muscles, and if you have where this area is not moving properly, what these guys are hypothesizing, and this isn't actually a new hypothesis at all, chiropractors have been saying this for decades, is that those ligaments will actually then act like sources of mechanical irritation, and they're going to start stretching the spinal cord, causing it essentially to stiffen up like this, which in turn is going to impede the flow of that fluid, like we're talking about, creating the pressure like this. And it's that reversal of the pressure to where the fluid isn't flowing the way that it is supposed to, that ultimately is going to go on to cause, quote, microstructural damage to the cerebellum, brainstem, cervical spinal cord, and lead to symptoms. So what are these guys saying in the longest possible way right there? What they're saying is that a mechanical issue with the upper part of the neck is leading to a mechanical and a neural overload problem, which in turn is leading to the source of irritation that is irritating on the cord. And that is one of the things that is contributing towards this symptomatic expression for people when they experience this thing called a Chiari malformation. So that's a big mouthful in and of itself right there. And we'll break this down into a few other bits and pieces. I'll jump back and forth a little bit here for you, but that's kind of it in a nutshell right there. And these authors, and I'll put the link in the description for this thing right here. I want to point out just a couple of little things for those people of you who maybe have been diagnosed with a Chiari malformation. Diagnostically, it's traditionally defined as being a herniation of 5 millimeters or more. In other words, a lot of times neurologists or radiologists, they don't consider these things significant until that balloon is already descending by about 5 millimeters like that. But, I'll tell you, after doing this for 15 years now, that there's a lot of people where their brainstem is 2 millimeters, 3 millimeters, and yet they're still experiencing all of the different symptoms and the problems. And so these guys, they actually openly acknowledge that, saying that, there's a certain, percent of the population where they do show the Chiari malformation, but they don't have symptoms. And other people, they have symptoms, but they don't meet the diagnostic criteria. It's something that's actually called a Chiari 0 or cerebellar ectopia. Fancy, definition, all that sort of stuff. My point being is that one way or another, it's asking for trouble. And so what they note is that there are actually a number of contributing factors. It's usually not just a matter of one thing that goes into creating these issues in the first place. So they go through just a few of these, and I'll mention just a couple of them so that I don't give everybody any leading thoughts in terms of, what is, what isn't, all that sort of stuff. One of them, simply put, is the shape of the skull. So this is my silly little plastic model again right here. And if you may notice the shape of the back of the skull, I'll bring it up right about there. A lot of people, the base of the skull actually extends all the way out like this, but since what's called the posterior fossa, the back part of the brain right there. So some people, it's very, very broad like this. Their head is literally like a bowling ball. But other people, that area is much shallower, like this. And it comes up at a much steeper angle. And so what that means is it means that if and when there's ever that source of irritation down through here, it's more likely that this is going to be sliding down a steeper slope versus it being held in the cup right there. Very little that a person can do about this. This is simply their bone structure, and this is why sometimes conditions like headaches, migraines, balance disorders can have a familial tendency. It's because that bone structure is inherited to daughter, from mom, from grandma, from great-grandma, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And it doesn't guarantee that they're going to have a problem. But what it does mean is it does mean that there's a greater probability that there's going to be a problem. Especially then if and when you combine it with this stuff right here. Physical trauma and stress. There is substantial evidence that physical trauma and activities play a role in the symptom onset for at least a certain subset of Chiari people. Car accidents, falls, head trauma, sports injuries, certainly common. A little bit more common in females, can even happen during pregnancy, physical exertion. In other words, there seems to be that there is this physical trigger that is making things become symptomatic. And one of the underlying issues then that the authors particularly talk about is the issue between the atlantoaxial, so it's that C1, C2. Some people, their ligaments are more flexible than others. Take me as an example. I am not one of those, let's get that so you can actually see that. I am not one of the people who can get his thumb, there we go, to touch the back of his wrist. Why? Because my ligaments aren't that elastic, at least through there. Other people, they can do that. And we go back to elementary school and we said, oh, it's because you're double jointed. No, it's not double jointed. It's that the ligaments, the composition of the ligaments in your body, they're more elastic than they are with other people. And so for some people, as opposed to having ligaments that are nice and solid, because they are more loosey-goosey elastic, it means that they can set the stage for injury. Now, this is actually something that I do want to mention because it is something where I disagree with the authors a little bit right here. They talk about atlantoaxial instability as being one of the major contributing issues. And again, this is an issue between C1 and C2. Now, based on what I know about spinal biomechanics, anatomy, and the way that the body works to adapt for physical stresses and things like that, I know that C1, C2 is the universal compensation joint. And by that I mean it doesn't matter whether you've got an issue with the skull, with your jaw, with your upper neck, with your low back, or with your little toe, that your body is going to use that C1, C2 complex as a way of compensating for it. Don't believe me? Walk around wearing only one shoe for a day. And at the end of the day, put your fingers in the base of your neck right here, and you will feel a very painful, very swollen area. Well, guess what that is? That's the C1, C2 area. So what the authors are saying is they're saying that they believe that that quote-unquote instability is what's creating, or at least setting the stage for some of these Chiari malformation symptom expressions. But what I would say is that the C1, C2 is actually part of the compensation pattern itself. And more likely, it's because that C1, C2, it's having to compensate for something else. My perspective, of course, because it's directly in the firing lines at C1, C2, it's most likely to compensate for a mechanical injury that actually happened at C1, between C1 and the skull. It's not broken, it's not dislocated, but sure enough, it still is significant enough to cause problems. And, you know, in particular, that's what my interest in being able to help people with Chiari malformations is. Doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to fix that malformation every single time, but it does mean that if you can help so that those joints are moving the way that they are supposed to, there's going to be less tension on the muscles, less tension in turn on the nerves, the proper flow of that fluid around the brain, and then when that happens, we hope and expect where the pressure is going to be lifted and where people can actually get relief from these conditions that otherwise can cause oh so terribly many problems. So that's kind of the take home. I don't think I'm going to go through the rest of the article. I'll leave you to suffer through that one on your own. But again, I'll put that in the link here. But that's kind of the takeaway right here, is that in brief, if you're experiencing either the symptoms of a Chiari malformation, or if you've been recently diagnosed and you want to know what you can do without just having to depend on drugs and surgery, what this article is suggesting is it's suggesting get somebody to have a proper look at how those vertebrae in the upper part of your neck are moving. Are they moving too much? Or perhaps are they moving too little? And then if you can get just the right kind of correction that can lift the pressure, that it can help get things going again the way that they should be so that you can ultimately get back to living life the way that you want to and having the greatest potential for the life that you ultimately deserve and desire. So, thanks for watching the video here. Again, this is the first one that I've ever done like this, and so if you do have any particular comments, feedback, or anything like that, please, I am all ears. I'm open to suggestions, ways of making things better, and all that sort of stuff. And or if you have any particular comments or things that you want me to have a look at here at some point down the track. Anyway, we'll leave you there. And so I leave you until the very next time. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.